Hope everybody's having a great time here at Twin Cities Drupal Camp. Day 1, or day 2 if you were at the trainings yesterday. We are going to talk about responsive images. We're going to talk about how we can make images work in a responsive world. And it might seem strange that if we're going to talk about responsive, that I'm going to have some cat photos. And cats are about the most unresponsive thing that you can have. So we're going to teach you how to literally wrangle cats.
Food.
Food
Wrangles cats. They always come from food.
Food wrangles cats.
Yeah.
Sure. So anyways, we're going to talk about how you plan out a responsive image implementation for your site. And the plan is more important than the Drupal part of it, because once you have the plan part, the Drupal part is pretty straightforward. Drupal has some great tools, and we'll talk about that, but the greatest tool that you have for responsive images on your site is your mind. And we'll talk about that. So, I'm Marc Drummond. This is my family up there. That's my wife, Rita, and my daughter, Izzy. And I'm a front-end developer at Lullabot. I've been there since this last fall. Before that, I worked in local government. You can reach me on Twitter at Marc Drummond, Marc with a C. That's the right way to spell it. And M Drummond is my username on Drupal.org and IRC. I am a co-maintainer of the Picture and Breakpoint modules for Drupal 8. So that's the responsive image stuff. Actually, it's the responsive images module. Changed the name. And I, long time interested in responsive web design, have implemented responsive images on a lot of sites, and I want to try to give you some practical tips and information from what I've done, and hopefully it will be useful to you. So, as we all know, if you've studied the history of the web, the internet, the web started at CERN and was developed primarily to be able to post cat photos on the internet. Initially it was just text, and you could only have descriptions of cat photos, and so that was sad, but then Netscape added images. And now there's lots and lots of images of cats and other things on the web. And that is great. It is wonderful to have images on the web. But there's some challenges that we have. So, you're going to go on the website. You sit down at your computer, your laptop, your desktop computer. You've got a nice big screen. And so the first thing you're obviously going to do is look for cat photos. And you find a really cute cat photo, right? And it's great. It looks wonderful. And it makes you happy. It makes you smile because you saw a cat photo. But then you have a challenge. You get your Android or your iPhone out, and you want to look, you're out and about, and you want to look at cat photos. And so you try to look at that same image, and it takes forever for it to download because it's a really big image. It looks great, but it's really slow, and it is annoying. Is anybody here annoyed when things load slowly on your phone? Yeah, I thought there might be one or two. So more than that. And then you're angry because it takes a while to load up an image. So here's the other alternative. We get out our phone and we have an image that's perfectly sized for the phone. And it looks great, but it's a smaller image. And we are happy. But then later on we get home, we get to our laptop, our desktop, and we look at that same image, and it's super blurry. And who wants to look at blurry photos? Nobody wants to look at blurry photos, and we're angry, right? So we have this problem with images that if you have a small screen and a small photo, we are happy, but if we have a large photo, we're sad. And if we're on a large screen and there's a small photo, we're angry. But a large screen, a large photo, we're happy. So that's kind of a conflict, an inherent conflict. So the solution is, what if we could provide different image files for different screen sizes? What if we knew which screen size you were on when you were looking at a particular image, and we gave you an image that was just as big as you needed for it to look great, for it to look nice and crisp, so that it didn't have to upscale the image and make it bigger, because that gets blurry and yucky. What if we could do that? So that would be the ideal solution. The challenge that's out there for how we do that is that browsers are really, really fast. Quick lesson on how a browser works. you go to a URL, and the browser requests a web page from the server. You get HTML back, and in most cases this is how it works. You get HTML back, and it has a list, and your browser tries to go through there, figure out the HTML, and then find all the files that it needs to download. So CSS, JavaScript, and images primarily. Maybe some videos. And the CSS and the JavaScript are really important. The CSS particularly because the browser can't do much of anything, right? If it doesn't know how to style the page. The JavaScript, particularly if you put it at the top of your HTML, then the browser has to kind of assume, well, this might be important too, because this could change the HTML, it could change the CSS, it could change the styles, and I really need to know that because I don't want to like render the web page multiple times. So it's going to take some time for it to do all that processing, but in the meantime, it still gets its list of all these images, and it's going to start downloading these images as soon as it can. And so the challenge is it's going to download those images before any of your CSS or JavaScript has been processed in most cases. So your browser can't know what the styles are, what the layout is for your web page. All it has to go on is the information that you put in the HTML. So that's kind of the conflict. And so the solution to this is, what if we put our layout information into our HTML, our information about our images, so the browser could select from different images and provide a different one. And that's not a totally foreign concept, because while we try to separate style from markup, we've long time, when it was just a simple image tag, you'd put the width and the height on it, and that's encoding size information, right? So this is kind of just another way to do this and provide more information. So how do we make this work? So this group, the Responsive Images Community Group, a group of web developers really put their heads together, worked with the browsers, and came up with a solution so that we could put some of our layout information into our markup. So this is the picture element. This is a new element in HTML that's already being supported in some browsers, and it's coming soon to other browsers. And what this lets you do is, if you've worked with, how many people have worked with responsive web design before? Right? So you're familiar with media queries and things like that. So this says, hey, we're going to start at the top, and if there's the viewport has a minimum width of 40 M, then here's the images that you should download. And otherwise, then we'll fall back to some fallback images. And so that way we can detect, here's the viewport size, and here's what gets used. The picture element has two really, really good use cases. And that is art direction. Art direction means, it can mean a lot of things, but in terms of images, you might have a really big wide image that looks great if you're on your desktop. But even if you shrink that down and provide a smaller source, like the subject of the photo might be really small. So if you could provide a tighter crop at that smaller size, then you could still see the subject of the photo. And this is a pretty challenging thing to actually get working, and we're not going to really talk about that so much today. But it's important to know. That's a really good thing for the picture module. And the other thing that is a little bit more common is you might use different aspect ratios for an image. On your big giant screen, if you have an image particularly that fills the whole screen, you might need to have that be shorter than if it's on a small phone, so that it doesn't scroll off the bottom of the page because it's just really big. So picture module, the picture element is really good for that. It's also really good for image types. You can put different types of images on different source elements. You can put WebP on one, which is a newer image format. Not all browsers support it, but it's really good for performance. And then you can put a JPEG as a fallback on a different source element. And so that's really good. But those use cases are maybe not the most common use cases. And the really thing that we really care about is we want our images to even just download quickly on phones and look great on desktop, right? We want to size the image based on viewport. So there's a couple other new attributes in responsive images that are useful for that: SourceSet and sizes. And size is basically similar here. We've got this is part of a media query called a media condition, and we're saying, here's the layout information you need to know, browser. This image, when it's larger, the screen is larger than 36 ems, which the M is generally 16 pixels, so that's about 500 pixels probably. Somebody can do the math here. Then it's going to be 33.3 VW, which is viewport width. It's a way of saying percentage without it being too confusing because the browser doesn't know what it's a percentage of. So VW is a percentage of the whole screen. So if it's a big screen, this image takes up a third of the screen. Otherwise, if it's smaller than that, it takes up the full screen. That's what that basically says. And then SourceSet has, here's these different images, and we're going to tell you 1024W, this image is 1024 pixels wide, the next one is 640 pixels wide, then 320 pixels wide. So browser, you now know how big this image should be on the screen based on the layout. Now you pick, I've given you some options. You pick the source that is at least as big as the space that's needed to fill up. And the browser can do the picking for that. And so that's a new thing. And you can do that with the picture element too. You can use that on source elements. But anyhow, so maybe not all browsers still implement this, but you can use a thing called picture fill. And picture fill is a JavaScript thing that will let this work in older browsers even if they don't support the standard yet. It's really great. So the cool thing is that Drupal helps to take care of a lot of the manual labor for this done that you might need to do. So in Drupal 7, there's the picture and the breakpoints modules. And with those modules, you can set up all the things that you'll need to do to make this work. And it'll take care of writing all that markup for you. And in Drupal 8, it's the responsive image and breakpoint modules. And those are built into core. Responsive image isn't turned on automatically. You have to go in and manually turn that on. But it's built in right into Drupal 8. And that's really cool and useful. However, you still need to have a plan. You still need to figure out, well, okay, that's great that Drupal can take care of writing the markup for me, but I still need to decide what size images should I put in there? What size images do I need so that my site will look great based on the different types of images on my site? And that's challenging because if you've worked with responsive web design, right, it's all about percentages. It's about, this sidebar takes up 40% of the screen at this breakpoint, and it takes up 30% at another one, and it takes up 100% somewhere else. And so you define things in percentages. And that's really good because devices come in all different sizes. You've got phones, you don't have just 320 pixels and 768 pixels and 1024 pixels. You've got screens all the way in between. So percentages let you fill those gaps, and it's really great. But the challenge is that content images, pictures of things, those are measured in pixels. They have a file size. If you've ever opened up a file in Photoshop or some other image editor, you'll see that it's certain images 400 pixels wide by 300 pixels tall. They have specific dimensions, and scaling images up gets blurry. Scaling images down is okay, but if you have too much scaling down, it's extra file size that you don't need. So what we want to do is plan out a solution by taking a look at the layout of our site. We want to analyze how our site's layout works and figure out what are the different types of images that show up on our site, what sizes are they at different breakpoints, and then we can start to figure out, all right, what file sizes do we need for our different images, and then we can use Drupal to put that into place. So we've got a blog post here. This is a site with a blog about cat photos because that's great. And we've got a couple photos on here. So we're looking at this on a desktop, and we've got a big photo on top. We've got a photo on the sidebar. Then we open up our phone. The big photo is still on the top, is still the full width. But then the one in the sidebar is actually dropping down, and it's almost the full width, but not quite, right? So we can at first say that we have a hero image on top. We can give it a name so that we have something to reference. And we have a side image. We'll call it that. And if you have a more complicated site, you're probably going to have more than 2 different types of images. But we'll start with that. We'll start with that to try to figure this out, right? So how do we figure out how big those are at different places? Well, a good place to start is by looking at your HTML. You could try to do this by guess and check. You could try to move your browser width around, and you could use Chrome DevTools and measure how big an image is at different places. And that's a quick and dirty way. But you might miss some things. There might be some style changes that you didn't quite realize. You might miss some breakpoints. So I think analyzing your HTML and CSS and having a good knowledge of your code base is important for figuring this out. So we have a post class, and inside we have a hero image and a post inner, and then inside post inner we have post body and post aside. And so we can start to look at the structure of the HTML and figure out where we go from there. So let's start at the hero image. So we have that post class at the top, the post article, and then post hero image, and then the image element itself. So how do we figure that out? So we look at our CSS, and we find out that there's rules that affect the layout for the .post class as well as for the image element. All image elements have been defined as a width of 100% and height of auto. And I'll talk a little bit later about why those are some really good defaults to use. And then the .post, it's an article. It's basically a div, so it automatically by default has a width of 100%. But we're saying if this gets really big and the viewport width is over 100 ems, which is over 1600 pixels, then we're going to set the width of this post to 1600 pixels. So that's going to be our maximum. And we can then make a little table to help figure this out. I really find one of the best tools for responsive images is Excel or Google Sheets or whatever spreadsheet tool of choice works for you. Something where you can start to write things down because math is involved. And that's why I have cat photos, to make everybody feel better about doing math. So here we go. We can figure out that by default the post is 100% wide, and the post hero image is 100% wide, the image is 100% wide. So the image is 100% wide, which we saw. And then we know that when we get to a breakpoint of min width 100M, then the post has a maximum width on it. Hero image is still 100%, so that carries on to the final width, which is 100M. So the maximum size this image will ever be is 1600 pixels. So let's look at the other example, the side image. This one's a little bit more complicated. So you've got the post, then you've got post inner, post aside, and post aside image. Those are our wrapper elements. Now we have to look at each of them and figure out what are the rules for each for the layout. So we already looked at the post, and we look at the CSS, and there's no rules for the post inner or the post aside image that affect the layout. But we look at post aside, and there are some rules, and they're a little bit more complicated. So post aside by default has a width of 100%, and it has padding of 5%. And then when the viewport gets to be 37.5 M, then we're going to float this left. We're going to have a padding of 2% and a width of 40%. And then once we get to a minimum width of 75 M for the viewport size, we'll put a padding of 1.5 rem on that. So then, we can break this down into a table. And we can come up with our rules. So by default, post is 100% until you get to the bottom, and then it's 100M. Post aside, we can start writing down, here's our layout rules. So 100% minus 5% times 2, because there's padding on both sides. 40% minus 2% times 2, and so on. And then we can calculate that out. We can multiply all these by each other so we can find out what the final width is. And we find that the image is 90% wide initially. It goes down to 36%, then here we're mixing percentages and pixels. So I'll show how you can make use of that. And then we have 640 pixels by 48 pixels. So there we've got our rules for how we would figure out the sizes. And generally percentages, but there's some fixed numbers in between. All right, we did some math, so here's a cat photo. We're going to take our cat out to the ballpark. We're going to do some ballpark figures and start figuring out, based on our layout information, which we understand a little bit better now, then we can start figuring out how wide do things need to be. So our hero image, we're going to say the minimum width is 320 pixels. It's certainly possible that there are screens that are smaller than that. You know, we may all be browsing on our wrists before too long, but 320 pixels is a default that I often use for the 100% of the width. So then the next thing that we do is we want to figure out, all right, for that default breakpoint, how big can it possibly be? So what we have to do is we have to multiply this 100% width by the width of the next breakpoint, where things change. So this 100M is 1600 pixels, and so if we want to find out how big will it be right before it changes, then it's 1599 pixels. And so then this is fairly straightforward. We know the smallest our image is ever going to be is 320 pixels, and the widest it's ever going to be is 1600 pixels. But those are still pretty big ranges, right? 1600 pixels is 5 times larger than 320 pixels. That's still way too much image. You can't have one image for all of those. So how do we figure out what are the in-between points between 320 and 1600? I like to use a rule of 25% in figuring this out. And you can come up with your own rule, but this is mine. And what I like to do is try to have about a 25% difference in width between one image and the next larger one. And 25% doesn't sound like maybe a ton, but you have to multiply that by the height as well for the total number of pixels, the total size of the image. So it's maybe 25% wider, but it's actually 56% bigger in terms of total area. The actual file size is going to vary. That's not necessarily going to translate exactly to file size, but it's a nice proxy that you can use in terms of having something to figure this out with. So I might start with that 320 pixels, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply it by 1.25, and then I'm going to get a list of image sizes until I get to a size that is larger than my maximum possible size. My maximum size is 1600, so this is the list of sizes that I come up with. And that's an initial ballpark figure, and we're going to clean that up in a little bit. So just to kind of go over this again with the side image, by default, here's our width rules. So it's just a matter of going through and doing some multiplication, and you can set up some Excel rules to do the math for you, which I often do. So I need 90% of 320 pixels, the minimum, and so that comes to 288. Then I need 90% of the next breakpoint. That comes out to 540 pixels. Same thing, I do 36% of the minimum width for that breakpoint, and that comes to 216. 36% of the next breakpoint is 432. Here I do some math. 40% minus of the current breakpoint minus 48 pixels is 432. 40% of the next breakpoint minus 48 pixels is 592. And then I know the exact width of the maximum size. So now we have our list of our minimum and our maximum for this type of image. We know that it's going to go somewhere between 288 and 592. And that's a smaller range, but it's still, the largest size is 2 times wider, but that's a total of 4 times as big. So you kind of have to make some choices. Sometimes you might get to a point where you have a smaller image, and you do the math, and you realize that the largest possible size is like 50% bigger than the smallest size, and you have to decide, is it really worth it to go the full route of responsive images for this, Or is it a small enough image where, yeah, it wastes a little bit of space, but you know, you got to make choices about that. But here, I think it's worthwhile to take a look. So again, I do my rule of 25%, and I come up increasing by 25% each time. And the 703 seems quite a bit bigger than the 588, or the 592. So I go the opposite way. I try going from 592, and I reduce it by 25%. And that 303 seems like not as big, more than 288. So that feels like a good starting point. So now I have an initial list of sizes that I can do for that. There's another thing I have to take into account, though. Not all screens have the same resolution. So a lot of screens now have a high resolution screen, or a retina screen is what Apple calls it. But there's lots of different devices that have higher resolution screens. And what they're doing is they're packing the number of pixels, twice as dense or some amount denser than what you would normally have. A pixel, in terms of a screen, is one piece of light that has a certain color in it. And our CSS, if can look at that and say, all right, here's 1 pixel to 1 pixel. But with a retina screen, you kind of fool around, and we put like 4 dots of light, but we pretend that there's only 1 dot of light there. And so there's more dense information in that, and so we get more information in a smaller amount of area, and it looks crisper. There's more information in a smaller amount of space. So anyhow, so we need to account for that, because if you provide a 1x image for a 2x screen, again, you're doing the upscaling, and it's getting super blurry. And that's no fun for everybody. So this part is fairly straightforward. We just have to multiply everything by 2. You can do a different ratio. You can do 1.5. But I like doing 2. It's very common. It's what iOS devices have for their screen resolution density. And that's pretty common. And there's not as much. There's a big difference between 1x and 2x. There's some that are even denser than 2x, but there's not as much of a difference visually between those. So I think 2x is a pretty good default. So I'll take a look, and the side images, I need to add these to my list of potential image sizes that I want to deal with. But that's still pretty messy. Like, you don't want to have 606.35. Like, that's not an actual pixel width, right? We have to get that a little bit more cleaned up. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at our initial list here, and that's really messy, and we're going to clean it up a little bit. So I look through this list, and I see, well, 781, that's kind of messy. So maybe I could move that to 800 pixels. And 800 pixels is twice as big as 400 pixels, which I need to have images that are twice as big as their others for the high density, so that's good. I'll move 976 up to 1000, that's twice 500. I'll move 1220 up to 1250, which is twice 625. And then I'll move 1525 up to 1600. And then 1600 is bigger than my biggest possible, that's my biggest possible size. So I can drop this 1907 number. And then if you look at what is the difference between each of these sizes, it's still around 25% for each, even though we cleaned this up a little bit. Again, I need to take into account the high resolution screens, and so I come up with my list of that. And once I have that in place, then I might make a few more adjustments. So I bumped 625 up to 640 because that was twice 320, and then I moved 1250 up to 1280 because it's twice 640, and so I make a few adjustments to my list. And now you can see that some of the 1x images have the same width as some of the 2x images, and so now I can get rid of that duplication, and I have a full list of file size widths, and they're all about 25% increases, just a little bit more in some cases. And I've gone from 18 source widths down to 11 source widths. Because if I'm going to have a lot of variations for these images, they take up space on the server, right? So if you can trim that list down, it's good, because then there's fewer variations out there. It takes up less server space, and yeah. So same thing with the side image. I'm going to clean that up a little bit. change 303 to 300. I'm just going to move those around a little bit, make that 600, which is still all around 25% from each other. And then I'm going to look at the 2x versions, and then I've got duplication between 600 and 600. So then I have a final list that's like that. So that's a fair amount of, it's still 7 file sizes. And if you increase the amount of difference between each one, if instead of you went up like 50% between each image, you'd have fewer file sizes that you had to create. But on the other hand, you're going to have a lot bigger variations, and people are going to download more images than they need more often. You're never going to get it entirely perfect, where for every single, you're not going to, if you increase it by 1% for every time, it's going to be unmanageable, right? There'd be fewer times where people download more image than necessary, but it would also mean a ton of different images that you're creating, image styles. So that's not great either. So now that information that we looked at earlier with the responsive images HTML format, now we have the information that we need in order to fill that out. We've looked at our layout and we've figured out, okay, by default we have 100% width. We translate that to 100 VW so that the browser can understand it before it's downloaded the CSS. At min width 100M, it's 100M. So all we have to do is put that information from largest to smallest into a sizes attribute. And that semicolon should be a comma in between the 100M and 100 VW. So I'll fix that before I post the slides. So there we go. We have the sizes information. Similar thing for the side. It's a little bit more complicated here, but we can look at our layout information, our breakpoints that we figured out, and the widths. We can translate that into something that will work well in the browser. You can use a calc function for when you're mixing percentages and more fixed widths like ems or pixels. And then you can put that information into a sizes attribute. So that's kind of how you fill out the sizes attribute. So how about that SourceSet attribute? That's the list of our file sizes. So we have our list of our widths for our different image sizes. So this is how we'd have to do it. We'd have to have a list of, here's all of our images. The path would probably be longer because you'd put the full absolute path to the image. And then we have the width with a W at the end of it. And then the browser can pick between all those. And we have a few less for the side image. But so that's great, but it sounds like a lot of work, right? Like, who wants to go to Photoshop and export an image 11 times, right? I don't want to do that, and I don't want to write this complicated markup myself. I would rather have robots do that. And that's what Drupal is. Drupal is our superpowered robot that is going to take care of this task for us. So that's what we'll talk about in a little bit, is how we can get Drupal to do our work for us. And so then the last thing then is our CSS rules. I just want to revisit that and mention it really quickly. So these are the rules I like to set for my images. I like to set it on the image itself. If you're going to change the width of an image and have it be 30% or something like that, put a div around it, put a class on that div, and set that rule on the div, not the image. That keeps it a lot simpler, where you can define all your images, with these same rules, and it's a lot less confusing. Height auto is just a good backwards compatibility browser default, just in case that has changed somewhere else and it filters down. Set it to height auto. And then width 100% is really good. What you'll find is that a lot of the responsive web design articles, responsive images article, will recommend max width 100%. That's what you often see recommended. And I'm not a fan of that as much. With width 100%, particularly if you're using a grid on your layout, which a lot of us are, right? A lot of us use a grid on our layout. Width 100% says, for this image file, we're going to fill 100% of the space available to us, the div that's around it. And we'll always fill that amount of space. We've done a lot of work so that there's not going to be any upscaling involved, right? We've figured out, here's the different file size widths that we'll need so we don't have any upscaling. But max width 100% means we're going to fill as 100% unless our image that has been uploaded is smaller than that. And that's not great because as much as we've set up our rules as good as we can, if somebody uploads a image that is really small, then you could get images that aren't filling that maximum amount of space. So I personally prefer width 100%. If you've done the work and max width is probably going to work fine too. But that's what I recommend. So now we've done all the work. We've done all the planning work. We looked at our site's layout and we've figured out what are the different file size widths. We've understood our site's layout. We know what we need to put in for our sizes and our source set attributes. So now we can start setting things up in Drupal. If you were wondering, if you type into Flickr cat dancing, will you find an image of a cat dancing? Yes, you will. You will find an image that matches the title's breakdancing. So I like that breakdancing cat. So anyways, Drupal has this breakpoint stuff that's built in. So to Drupal 8, and it's in the breakpoints module for Drupal 7. And so what do we do with it? So when we're doing viewport-based sizing, like we've been talking about here, all we need is an empty source set. And that gets built in by default to Drupal 7, which is great. So we need to create a breakpoint group. So you go to add a new group. I like to just call it sizes because I'm going to use this for all the different sort of image styles that I create. And then I'm going to select that breakpoint. And there we go. I have a breakpoint group. You can export that information and put it in your .info file for a theme, but you don't need to. It depends on how you're dealing with staging and stuff between environments. But that puts the breakpoint in the theme, not the breakpoint group, so you're probably going to need to deal with that with features or something like that if you're moving between environments anyhow. So in Drupal 8, there's not a UI for breakpoints. So you set this in a breakpoints.yaml file, which is just a simple key value pair. So you put your theme name in there, .empty, label empty, media query, just like that. And you put that into your theme, and that's what you'll need to do in order to create your responsive image styles. All right, so now we get to send in the actual robots and have them do our work for us. So we have our list of file widths for our heroes, and we have our file widths for our side images. And now we just need to go to image styles. How many people have made image styles before on a Drupal site? Right? That's a pretty common thing to do. So this part, now we know what to do for each of these things. We just have to, take a few minutes, and it's like a little bit of a tedious task, but we have the information that we need to make all of these different ones. So you need to name the things, the image styles. I like putting a prefix and then the number for the width or the height. So width _ x. And then if I happen to have two different styles of image on the side that have the same width, then I can reuse that. Sometimes images have you're just constraining the width of the image. You don't care how tall it is. Sometimes you're constraining the aspect ratio. So maybe you put rectangle or square in there. You need to select the actual effect that you're going to do with image styles. If you're just constraining the width, you'll probably do scale. You might do scale and crop if you're restricting both. If you're restricting it and, scale and crop is probably more if you're going to be changing the aspect ratio of the image because it needs to fit into a certain amount of space on the site. So then we put in the 300 width, and then we add the effect, and there we go. We have a new image style. And we have to just do that, 5 more times or 10 more times to create all the different image styles that we're going to use for this type of image. Then we're going to create what's called a picture mapping in Drupal 7. In Drupal 8, it's called a responsive image style. What we're going to do is we're going to create that association between our sizes attribute and our different image styles that we've created. So here we are in Drupal 7. We go to the picture configuration page, we're going to choose Add to add a mapping. And the first thing we have to do is select our breakpoint group that we created, that sizes breakpoint group. And then we're going to name this style of image. So I'm going to say side image. And then we have the breakpoint in here for empty source set. We're going to use the sizes attribute. Got this a little bit out of order. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Cool. You would have another thing that comes up, and you have a little text field that says sizes, and that's where you put the sizes attribute information that we figured out before. And then there's just a list of checkboxes where you select the image styles that you're going to use with that breakpoint. So this can get more complicated if you're doing the art direction use cases that I mentioned, or you're changing the aspect ratio at different breakpoints. But I just want to talk about the most common use case right now. In Drupal 8, fairly similar. You add a responsive image style, and then you also have to select a fallback image style. So if the responsive image stuff isn't working, I typically put in the smallest possible size as a fallback, so that at least something shows up if something really goes wrong. It's generally not going to go wrong, but just in case, it's good to have a fallback. We're still working on some of the Drupal 8 UI for the sizes, and hopefully that will get in the next few weeks here, or maybe even this weekend. Come to the sprint day on Sunday and you can help me out so we can get that into Drupal 8. But it'll be very similar to Drupal 7, hopefully. Oh, I didn't miss a slide. So here's the side information, the sizes information, and then we just put that in here to that sizes field, and then we select our image styles. So there we go. Now Drupal has the information that it needs to do all our work for us. We're not quite done, I don't think. We've done a lot to figure out so that we're downloading the right size image at the different screen sizes, but there's more that you can do to make your images load quickly. One thing to really make sure you go check is the image toolkit page in Drupal 7. I think in Drupal 8 it's called image quality, maybe still image toolkit, but basically this is where you set the quality percentage for your images. If you set it to 100%, your images will look super crisp and they will be ginormous. They will be really huge. And you generally can't tell a difference visually between a quality percentage of 75% and 100%. And so I recommend looking at your individual site and like what are your needs for the site, and try some different percentages out. Try it at 50% or at 60% or 70%, and see how low you can go. Because the lower you can go, the smaller your file sizes will be. So check it out. I think 60 is a good thing to aim for, 60 or 50. But check how your images look and make a decision. So how do you make use of this? You created a responsive image style or a picture mapping. How do you actually use it on your site? And let's say that you're on a content type. You want to configure content types. There's an image that always appears at the top of an article. So you would go to the content type article, then you go to manage display, which is where you manage the display of the various fields that are on your content type. And we have an image here. So we're going to change the field formatter. We're going to change it to use our new responsive stuff. So we change the format from image to picture. And then there's some new controls that pop up on the right. And so we're going to click on that gear icon. We're going to select our picture mapping, which is side image. And then we're going to put width of, we're going to select our fallback style there in Drupal 7. One cool thing is that in Drupal 8, we don't have to select the fallback image on every single field formatter. It's built into the responsive image style, which is a nice improvement. So that's the pattern that you'll see almost anywhere that you select image information in the UI. If you're configuring stuff in views and you're putting an image in views, you see very similar controls there. And if you're doing something with panels, and you have an image that you're directly placing in panels, then you get controls which have basically the same settings. So that's the model that you'll use in picking this stuff. Sometimes you'll get some really difficult situations where you need to apply a responsive image style, but there's no UI that allows you to do that. I ran into this a couple times on a recent project where we were getting a frame from a video for a preview image, and it didn't have a field formatter for that type of video preview image. So I couldn't change anything in the UI. I was trying to change author profile photos, and there was not a UI that I could, for the particular thing I need to do, there's no UI for it. So I had to dig into code. So some fun code here that was really fun to figure out, let me tell you. This is with Drupal 7. How many people have done pre-processed stuff? So don't worry about this if you haven't done pre-processed stuff. But if you have, this will be handy for you. If you ever have to use this, just reference these slides and you'll find that this code will be helpful. You have to do a picture mapping load with your picture mapping name, store that. Then you have to use picture get mapping breakpoints and store that in the fallback style. And then you do theme picture with those image options that you set. So in Drupal 8, this is simpler. You don't have to get breakpoints. You just have to define the picture mapping name here on a render element. So most of you don't need to worry about that, but if you ever do, here you go. This is how you do it. So anyhow, that's how you do viewport sizing of images in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 and how you plan out a solution for that. So I really hope that you make use of this. It does take time. I'm not going to lie. Like doing the math and figuring out for each of the types of images, it definitely takes time to do that and set up the configuration. But the result is a really big performance win for your website. There's a lot of things that affect how fast your website loads, but it has to download a lot of files, and the file sizes get bigger and bigger every year. It's up to like an average of like 2 to 3 megabytes per web page. That's a lot for a web browser, particularly if you're on a phone. Not everybody has great bandwidth, and sometimes it gets really slow. And if that's happening, then you're losing people. If people are coming to your page and it's taken more than a second or two to load, a couple seconds, they're going to be gone. They're going to say, I'm sorry, but I've got other things to do in my life, and it's never going to load. So since images take up like 75% typically of a particular page's load, if you can reduce that, particularly for smaller screens, and still make your images look great. Images are great. They're a super powerful tool. They stir up emotions, in ways that other things don't. They tell 1,000 words, and they're fantastic. But you still want them to load quickly so that people can see that really cute kitten, right? They can see that cat, and it can make them smile. And yet they can do so in a way where they get to your information, and they're happy about using your site because it loads really quickly. So that's responsive images. I really hope you'll take the time to use these on your sites. I'm Mark. If you have questions, I'll be at the camp here all weekend. Feel free to ask me questions or contact me. Send me a tweet. Reach out to me, and I'll be glad to help you out with this. So, thank you very much. Anybody have any questions? Yeah?
Do you deal especially with images that the user is likely to zoom in on responsive image? Like if there's a map or something, let's say.
Yeah, if you could, in theory, if there's something that you really think people are going to load in, you could load an image that's even higher than like the 1x or 2x resolution that you need so that they can zoom. You just got to look at your site and what are your use cases, how are people going to use this image. And so, yeah, that's something you could take into account when you're making your plan.
How's that going to work on the scroller bar?
In what?
On the scroller bar, where you have different images flash.
Like a carousel, do you mean?
Yeah, like a carousel.
Right. So, same thing. You just have to plan out how big they're going to show up in the carousel. and then make your plan for that. So I was just working on a media gallery and was doing this for a site just this week, and so I had a plan for how big are the images going to look when they're in the carousel, how much if you expand them, like click and expand the image, and I had a different image source for that, so that could get loaded in. So, yeah. Other questions? Other thoughts? Yeah.
Is there any breakpoints integration with WYSIWYG?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, definitely. I've used this with CK Editor and WYSIWYG. So generally, like, you go into the WYSIWYG profiles, I think it is, and there's a box that you check that says picture or responsive images, and that will set up the integration so that there's some documentation on Drupal.org about how to do that. But definitely you can integrate this with the WYSIWYG so that as somebody is, if you're putting, it's harder, but if somebody's putting it embedded in the body field and they need to pick like what size image, and you can tell them, okay, select the responsive image style, left or something like that, left content, left body, or for something that appears like you set up the styles and then and let them pick. So yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
So this method will also work if, like, say your global layout had a different aspect ratio of the image.
Yes. Yeah. So what you would basically do with that is that you'd figure out the breakpoints for where those aspect ratios are going to change. And then when we did the breakpoint setup, you're going to set up a different breakpoint for each of those things. And then you can still, if there's a wide range of sizes, in between where those aspect ratios changes, you can still use the sizes in SourceSet for each of those. So you can pick the range of image styles you'll need at the small one and the range of image styles for the large one. And then when you go to do the picture mapping, you just select those different breakpoints that you're going to use. And then for each one, you set the sizes and you pick the image styles that are appropriate for that one. And you just have to generate the image styles for those different aspect ratios. So, and when I've done that, I've usually put some sort of prefix in there, like, aspect 56 or something like that for 56%, or aspect 50%. And that is something that I do think comes up, particularly, there's a big trend for having images, right, that stretch the entire width. And that's not something that's generally sustainable on a large screen. You can't have a full width image that's of a normal aspect ratio. You generally have to go down to like 30% to 40% for that, and then to also see the content below it. So yeah. Yep. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, one more question.
Just wondering,
Yeah.
taking notes here, with, are there pretty good tutorials that kind of go over this as well? Or other resources, so
so one really good thing, if you want to understand the concepts of responsive images, there's a really good article series by Jason, is it Griggs or Grigsby? Anyways, it's on the Cloud4 blog, and it's called Responsive Images 101, and it really goes through each of the different aspects of the markup, and also in how to use some of these things in CSS. So, yeah, and I'm hoping to turn this into some articles that I'll post as well. So, yeah, so there's a good reference out there. Cloud4. Yep. Anything else? Yeah.
I know this is probably a beginner question, but
Oh, that's okay.
what is the best image resolution to start out with before you start breaking these down?
As big as possible, like in terms of what you want people to upload, like
Okay.
content people to upload. That's another really important thing, is that you want to give guidelines based on the types of images for where the images are getting used. Give guidance to people for how big are the images that they should upload. And I think in general, as long as space allows on your server, as big as possible. We might get bigger screens down the road. And Drupal will take care of sizing those images down to what's going to show up on the screen, so as big as possible, so you have as much room to work with.
I had a client that sent like 1.5 inch and wanted me to use this.
Yeah, that's going to be really hard. You can't do much with that. I mean, if you're going to pick a number, like a lot of cameras, like you might get a full size image that's 3,000 to 4,000 pixels wide, and that's pretty big. If it's like 10,000 pixels, that's pretty huge, and maybe you cut it down a little bit from there. But I think like if you can get 3,000 pixels to 4,000 pixels, that's good. Generally, unless you have some really big things and you have an image that a layout that's not constrained at all. If you have a layout that will go 100% of the width, and you're going to have images that are 100% of the width no matter what, the biggest screens right now, and this could change, are generally like 2560 pixels wide, but if they're retina screens, which some of them are, you're looking at like 5100 pixels wide, something like that. So you're going to need image sources, and I think that's important for people to understand. You want images that go full width, and you want them to look good on like high resolution screens, you're talking about 5100 pixels. That is a huge file to download. Like constraining the aspect ratio will help a little bit, but it's still, it's really big. There's a performance cost for that. Generally, people on desktops have higher bandwidth images, higher bandwidths. The other thing I guess I don't know if I mentioned was that the good thing about this SourceSet and sizes combination is that the browser is the one that decides which image file gets downloaded. And so in theory, the browser can take bandwidth into consideration. And in theory, if you're on a slow bandwidth connection, browser could decide or let you decide, I want blurry images just so I can see something, just so the web pages load. I don't know that any browsers are necessarily doing that right now, but in theory, they might do that in the future. So, anything else? Yeah.
Have you seen any stats about what percentage of the time the keyboard size is going to change while someone's looking at a page, so that you end up downloading the image twice rather than?
I don't know. I would guess that the two biggest times that happens is when you're on a mobile device, like a phone or a tablet, and you rotate it. That's probably the most common use case. The other most common use case is probably if you're a web developer and you like moving your browser back and forth to see what happens. And I'm not as concerned about the second use case, right? But I don't know. I think about how I use my phone and my tablet, and usually the only time I will rotate it is if I need to watch a video or something like that. I don't tend to do that. I don't know what the stats are, but some of the things I don't know. I don't know that it happens all that often. Yeah. All right. Well, feel free to come up and ask me any other questions, and thank you very much, and appreciate everybody's time.